Good evening, everyone. My name is Rod Walton. I am the Director of Outreach for the Learning Center and here at Hamlin Robinson School. And I want to welcome you back to this year's installment of the HRS Speaker Series. Um, Also, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us tonight. I really hope that tonight's event is inspiring and keeps you connected and empowered to the work that we're doing here. The mission of Hamlin Robinson School is to ignite the academic and creative potential of students with dyslexia and other language-based learning differences. Our Learning Center is the community outreach arm of our school. We are a resource hub to the community, offering services such as screenings, tutorings, professional development workshops for educators and parents, and events like the speaker series. If you have questions during the presentation, please send those through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. We'll make sure that we get those to our guest speaker after the main presentation. If you're a Washington State educator and you attend this full live event, you're eligible to register for clock hours. Please visit our speaker series page on our website for more information. We will be sharing a recording of tonight's event on the HRS Speaker Series website, and the link will be posted sometime within the next week. We encourage you to share that link with others who may benefit from tonight's information. Also on that webpage, you'll have access to recordings from our past events over the last 3 years, all free of charge. Now on to our event. I am truly honored to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, David Kilpatrick. David is a national acclaimed author, researcher, literacy expert, and professor emeritus of psychology at the State University of New York at Cortland and certified school psychologist with nearly 3 decades of experience working directly in schools. Since 1994, Dave has been shaping minds and guiding educators through his courses on learning differences and educational psychology. As a leading reading researcher and author of Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties and Equipped for Reading Success, Dave has helped transform how we understand and support struggling readers. He's also the co-editor of Reading Development and Difficulties, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Practice, a work that connects cutting-edge research and real-world class strategies. Dave is joining us live from North Syracuse in upstate New York tonight, and I assume it's pretty nippy out there as it is here in Seattle, Dave. But we thank you for staying up late with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so it is a little bit like Seattle here. It's raining. So and just one little comment is I'm not a leading reading researcher. I do research for sure, and I have for many years, but I'm more of a cover band. Okay, so the stuff that I write mostly is to try to synthesize the research for educators and school psychologists, other educational professionals. So tonight is going to be a pretty fast-paced presentation, and I'm going to cover a lot, but really I have a very narrow focus that I'll tell you up front. And that is one characteristic of kids with dyslexia that's common in all alphabetic writing systems. So that would be English and Spanish and Italian, etc., is they're not good at remembering words. So they may or may not be good at sounding out words, depending on their training and how much instruction they got in phonics, but they're not good at remembering words. And our focus is going to be on that tonight. So the objectives are how word level reading works. My daughter-in-law told me she had never been to a basketball game before. 2 years ago, we were at her son's, my grandson's first time he played basketball in 6th grade. And she turned to me and said, I've never been to a game before. Don't know anything about basketball. But she could watch the basketball game and figure out what skills are needed. You got to be able to dribble, pass, shoot, and play defense. We don't have that same advantage when it comes to reading because what's going on is going on between our ears. We can't see it. So we have to look at 40 years, 50 years of research into reading to understand how it actually works. We can only see the output. We don't see what's going on between our ears. And so then we identify the specific skills that you need, just like the basketball analogy. What are the skills that are needed for reading? And I'm going to kind of lay them all out. And the focus, as you see, there's word level reading, which is foundational for comprehension, right? If you can't read the words, you're not going to comprehend what you read. I will say a little bit about comprehension, but not a whole lot, but I'll steer you in a direction of a good resource. And then why kids struggle. And I will tell you the answer to that question up front. there's one of the skills that they need for reading that are lacking, or more than one of those skills. And we'll see what those are as we go through. And then based on that, we'll consider some best practices for assessing those skills, figuring out where the problem lies, and secondly, for intervening. So let's take a look at the skills. Many of you have probably heard of the simple view of reading. It's important to realize that nobody who researches the simple view of reading, and certainly not its developers, are saying reading is simple. The simple view of reading simply indicates that reading comprehension, which is the goal of reading, is made up of two broad skills. That's where the simplicity comes in, just two broad skills. Your ability to read words and your ability to comprehend the language in which something is written. So if someone read something to you, would you understand it? And if you can, then you have the language comprehension you need for the reading comprehension. Then it's a matter of, can you read the words efficiently enough? That's it. That's why it's called the simple view. Now, it gets much more complex from there, as you're going to see. And I'm not giving you all the complexity. I'm just going to give you the most useful aspects of the complexity, but all organized under this idea of the simple view. So we're going to focus tonight on the word level reading. There's two aspects to word level reading. First of all, when we read, some words we know and some words we don't know. So the words we know, we read out of memory. The words we don't know, we figure it out somehow. Now, we have decades of research to show of the classical approaches to teaching reading, phonics comes out with superior results to the other approaches, the whole word approach, the whole language approach. Not some of the time, not mixed results, literally all the time, okay, in every study. But we have to realize what's happening here is we're figuring out a word. Phonics helps us figure out words. Does that mean there's no context? Well, no, there are times we have to use context. You read a word, is it lead or led? Is it present or present, right? But that's a backup system. So the way I put it is context is a lousy engine. It's a good caboose, okay? And the engine has to be the knowledge of the code to track through the word to figure that out. All right, so some words we don't know, we sound them out. But how do we get to the point where we know words? Well, here are the terms I'm going to be using tonight. One is phonetic decoding. That's for the process of sounding out a word. The reason I always use the adjective phonetic in front of it, because in the reading research, decoding can refer to word reading in general, as opposed to comprehension, or it can mean more specifically figuring out a word that you don't know. Teachers use it the latter way. But because researchers use it both ways, I use the word phonetic decoding to make it clear. We're not using the broad term, which could mean reading the words off the page regardless. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't, okay? And then what's called the orthographic lexicon. Teachers would know this as the sight word vocabulary, meaning all the words that jump out at kids immediately upon, on sight. And it means it's stored in memory and they know those words. Now, there's a reason why researchers call this an orthographic lexicon instead of a sight word vocabulary. It's because orthographic lexicon sounds way cooler, doesn't it? It just sounds like a really cool thing, right? So when you're talking with a parent, you say, I think your son has a rather limited orthographic lexicon. I say, whoa. Anyway, so the orthographic lexicon is basically that body of familiar words that we have. And for those of us adults, particularly those of us that didn't have any difficulty learning to read, we have tens of thousands of words stored in the orthographic lexicon for immediate effortless retrieval when we see those words. So that's how we go. If I go back to the earlier one, that's how the words we know are the words in our orthographic lexicon. The words we don't know, we have to sound out with phonetic decoding, maybe backed up in some cases with context in certain types of words, like I said. Okay, so those are two skills that go under word level reading, but let's see if we can go a little deeper. So what do you need? What if you're not good at phonetic decoding? What are the skills you need for that? It's a little more complex than this, but it's still these building blocks, and that is letter sound knowledge. You have to know T says T, M says M, right? There's your basic code knowledge, and A says, well, A says a lot of things, doesn't it? Yeah. But anyway, you get my point. We have to know the sound values associated with the letters, and we use that information to figure out the word, but we need a phonological skill. And just for clarity, the term phonology and phonological has to do with what you might call auditory information related to speech, right? And we're not talking about general environmental sounds like airplanes going over, a baby crying, or a dog barking. We're talking about the sounds related to speech. That's phonology. And a phonological skill that is needed for phonetic decoding is blending. blending phonemes. So if you've worked with kids who struggle, you know that child who will pronounce each sound, they'll get each sound, but then they can't blend it. They'll go, ah, t, dog, or they'll go, ah, t, and look at you and say, what's the word? And you're like, what's the word? You just sounded it out. There's a child that has enough letter sound knowledge to properly identify the sounds associated with those letters, but they can't blend them together. That's a phoneme or phonological skill. All right, the orthographic lexicon. The orthographic lexicon isn't a skill. Phonetic decoding is a skill, but the orthographic lexicon is a resource that gets built through a skill, and that skill is called orthographic mapping. That is the memory process that's used to take an unfamiliar word and turn it into a very familiar word that jumps out at us instantaneously. So that's the skill. So the skill would be phonetic decoding and orthographic mapping, and the mapping is designed to build that lexicon. Because when you think about it, as adults, we don't sound out too many words, maybe some names, maybe some new big words we see occasionally, but for the most part, we're reading words instantly out of our existing mental dictionary, orthographic lexicon. Lexicon is just a fancy word for dictionary. So we build the orthographic lexicon, especially those of us who are typical readers, just a reading experience. You see more words, you keep adding those words to long-term memory. Now, here's an important point about that. I want you to dwell on this fact. Of the tens of thousands of words that are tucked away in your long-term memory, some you learned in first grade, some in third grade, fifth grade, and some you might have just learned recently. But of the tens of thousands of words, what percentage of them, when you first encountered them, did you put conscious effort into remembering for the future? If you're like most people, the answer is hardly any, right? When we learned all these words, we came across the word, we sounded out a brand new word. We didn't run and get flashcards. We didn't cover it up and try to memorize it. We moved on. We were reading for meaning. So we had a very brief time period in which that word, after just kids from second grade on, typically developing readers, only need to see a new word 1 to 4 times. Kids with dyslexia, we don't really have a number. I don't know of a study that's actually tested it, and I'm sure it varies depending on the severity of the dyslexia. So I know of a couple studies that give us a rough estimate. One study had third and fourth graders with dyslexia, and they had a set of words they had to learn, and they still didn't get them after half of them, they still didn't get after 18 exposures. And yet the first graders that were in the control group that were typical readers got all of them long before 18 exposures. They got them within 6 exposures, the whole pack, right? So the speed of remembering words is highly inefficient. This orthographic mapping process is inefficient. But for the most of the rest of us, if you're good at orthographic mapping, the best way to become better at reading is to read more, because you encounter new words and those words get added to the sight vocabulary, and that just grows. Notice something amazing about the orthographic lexicon is words go in and they stay there. When was the last time you looked at a word you knew and didn't know what it was? You might have forgot the meaning. That happens from time to time. But all the words that are in our orthograph, you could see a word you have not seen in print for 5 years and it's still going to jump out at you instantly. It's really an amazing process. Okay, well, what are the skills you need? That reading experience is a situation that helps build the orthographic, put you in the process of orthographic mapping. But what are the skills? Letter sound proficiency and phonemic analysis proficiency. I'm using the word proficiency synonymous with automaticity. If things are automatic, we don't even have to think about them. For example, every word you hear me say, you are not putting conscious effort into retrieving that word. It's there. It's automatic. It's effortless. So letter sound proficiency, I'll talk about these a little bit more later. You have to have automaticity. It's not enough just to have letter sound knowledge. That's useful for phonetic decoding, but for this orthographic mapping process. So stop and think about this. If the process of storing words is going on automatically and unconsciously in the background, that means the skills required for that process themselves have to be automatic. So your access to letter sounds would have to be automatic. And same thing with phonemic analysis proficiency. Analysis meaning pulling words apart. I'm reluctant to say segmentation because segmentation is a task that we use, and its correlation with reading is much weaker than other phonemic tasks that we use with kids. So really, analysis meaning pulling apart words is also necessary. It'll become clear why that is as I go through. But this is it. You're going to get some explanation of how these fit in, especially under orthographic mapping. I think we're fine, and I think you can understand how it works with the phonetic decoding. But you're looking at the dribbling, passing, and shooting and playing defense right here, these 4 across the bottom. Show me a child who is skilled with all 4 of those who's struggling in word reading. I don't think you're going to find that kid. Show me a child who is poor at any one of those who's a good reader, right? So those are necessary skills, and collectively they're sufficient, all right? Now, just as a teaser, in the further reading at the very end, the very last slide, which you'll have access to if you don't already. And there's a book, Oak Hill, Kane, and Elbro, and they cover language comprehension, reading comprehension. It's only 114 pages, easy read, packed with great information by lifelong researchers in the area of reading comprehension. So that's my teaser. But we're going to leave that aside for now, and we're going to focus on word level reading. Oh, look at that. Reading experience influences a lot, doesn't it? Okay. So the value of the simple view is to know what those components are, to know what the dribbling, passing, shooting, and playing defense are when it comes to reading. And that allows us to know what to assess and evaluate to find out why a child struggles. And it makes sense of reading difficulties, because why did that child not make the basketball team? Well, you could isolate it. Maybe they weren't very good at shooting. Maybe they weren't good at passing, or couldn't play defense very well, or some combination of those, right? So once we know what the factors are that lead toward skilled reading, we can assess and figure out why a child's struggling. And that will help guide in the instructional decisions and intervention. We'll know what to focus on. All right, let's go back to that one side of the equation. We have 2 levels of word reading: identifying an unfamiliar word, and the second is remembering words. Now, this science of reading movement that you hear a lot about, I use the term science of reading for the movement of getting information out of the research journals into classrooms. Okay, so I use that term science of reading for the movement. The actual research goes by a whole bunch of different names. We just say scientific research on reading, the reading research, et cetera, et cetera. And so that movement seems to me, and I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but my perception has been, since it started about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, it's kind of focused more on the phonics. And I was kind of around for the launch of that whole movement in 2015, 2016. And the process of remembering words was going to be a big part of it. And somehow that's gone to the wayside. But let it be, here or there. Let's just move on. And people need, when you think about it, most everybody's talking about how to get kids to read words and figure out words. Not as much talk about how you get them to remember words. And the memory for words is so important. That's what drives fluency. Children who know all the words in a passage, the words are going to jump out at them. They're going to be accurate. They're going to be fast. Children that don't have as many words stored away in long-term memory, and there are a number of words in a passage they don't know, their fluency drops off. That's why you give a skilled 4th grade reader, you give them a 9th grade passage, and their fluency drops off the map, okay? Because there are too many words they don't know. You say, this kid doesn't have an inherent fluency problem. It's they don't know enough of the words, right? Anyway, with that said, this may not be intuitive, but as it turns out, that second skill of remembering words requires that first skill because of the code aspects to it, all right? So let's take a look. Here is a study that was done in the 90s with 2nd and 3rd graders, as you see. And across the bottom, they're testing both of these things that we saw on the previous screen. Pseudo word naming is just another word for nonsense word reading. They're used totally equivalently. And exception word reading is another word for irregular word reading. They're used totally equivalently. Those are just the terms often researchers like to use. And so they gave kids 100 words of varying difficulty that were nonsense words, starting out really easy and just getting harder. They gave them 80 words to test how many words they've accumulated that they've learned. How did they do that? They used exception words that if you sound them out, they're not even going to be close. So beaucoup just doesn't sound like anything, right? Okay, so that would be bouquet, right? So you had words like bouquet and chauffeur and rendezvous and yacht. In other words, the only way you could get that right, because it's on a list, it's not in any context, is if you already know the word. All right, so that way they were testing their sight vocabulary, their orthographic lexicon. Well, look what they found. They found that the children in the bottom half of the group of the distribution in their ability to sound out words were also in the bottom half at remembering words. And the kids in the top half of sounding out words were in the top half of remembering words. But look what you have here. You have kids who are actually really good at phonics. They have really good phonetic decoding skills, but they're still weak readers. They're still in the bottom half of the distribution at remembering words. And look what's missing. Where are the kids that are really good at remembering words that don't have that foundational code knowledge? That allows us to know that the phonics skills are necessary, but not sufficient for being a good reader. So phonics has its limits. Really, it's the focus is on getting kids to identify words, which you just saw is absolutely essential. Any reader of an alphabetic writing system, even if they were never taught phonics, they have phonics skills. We know that because they can sound out nonsense words. How can you possibly sound out a nonsense word without phonics skills, right? You give a skilled reader who was taught through a whole language approach and never taught any phonics whatsoever, and they're in third grade and beyond, and they're doing just fine in reading. You give them blat and prup, they don't look at it and go, whoa, what am I going to do with this? They say blat and prup, okay? What that meant is they developed the skills they needed, even though they weren't taught. Well, what about their peers that were struggling? They didn't get that information, which is really unfortunate. So everybody needs phonics. It's essential. Some kids don't need so much, like the example I just gave, but a large portion of the population, it's just not going to fall into place for them without that instruction. Anyway, so all skilled readers need this, as I said. They figured out the phonics. They learned to read in spite of the instruction rather than because of the instruction, right? And I just said that. All right. But one of the problems with phonics is it only deals with that one aspect of, you can become the best dribbler ever and still not be a good shooter, right? So it's not the whole game. We have to also look at memory for words. So here's an interesting observation, which I did mention before. What's the most obvious thing about our own reading? The words jump out at us. They're coming from a memory bank of words, right? Effortlessly. And here's a little puzzle. What in the world would this auditory skill of phonemic awareness have to do with visual word reading? It just doesn't make sense. There's nothing obvious about that. Well, as we go through over the next several minutes, you're going to see we're going to unravel this mystery, okay? And we can do that if we, number one, understand how alphabetic writing works, and number two, how our memory system interacts with alphabetic writing. Once we understand both of those, suddenly it's like, oh, now I see why these phonemic skills are so essential for reading. All right, how we remember words. First of all, we have to understand how alphabetic writing works. Now, Chinese writing, I'm going to oversimplify here, but Chinese writing does have maybe several hundred, a couple thousand characters where one single character means one word. And then, of course, they might combine two characters. Like a colleague of mine told me from Hong Kong, told me they'll use the word electricity or electric, and they'll put that right next to the word for brain, and then that combines and becomes the word computer. Okay, so they might use more than one character, but what I'm getting at is you can have just one single character means a word. Okay, that's not how alphabetic writing works. In alphabetic writing, individual characters do not represent whole words. We don't write words; we write phoneme characters in alphabetic writing. So we just have 3 words in English, really 2.5, as you'll see. Okay, we have that's one word and one character. I, first person singular, one word, one character. O, in poetry, according to the Oxford Dictionary, that's archaic. It's OH, it's kind of kicked out of the club. Okay, so that's why I say we only have 2.5 words in English that are words that we write. Those are the only words that we write right there. Again, if you're using poetry. Instead, we write a sequence of phoneme characters, and we call that sequence of phoneme characters a word. So alphabetic writing is phoneme writing. Somewhere along the line, it got called an alphabet, which is not helpful. It's based on the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. Not very informative. So we have phoneme writing. That's what alphabetic writing is. And if you have poor access to the phonemes within the spoken word, you're going to have a hard time learning to read an alphabetic language. Now, most people are going to go, oh, yeah, that makes sense for sounding out words, but for remembering words, that's really not so obvious. All right. So Linnea Airy came up with the solution as to how we remember words back in the 1970s. I read an article in the Journal of Educational Psychology by her from 1978. I read it years ago, and I just reread it a few months ago. I was startled. It's like it could have been written 4 weeks ago. Right on target. And then there's been decades of research by her and by others validating this theory. Basically, sight words are familiar spellings. It's the spelling of the word that we're remembering, not the visual look of the word. Look at all the different variations on that word bear. Every single one of them is landing in the same little entry in the orthographic lexicon. It's not based on visual. It's based on that letter order. So if you look at the first two entries there, lowercase bear, a child learns that word to the point where it's automatic. Then the first time they see the uppercase version of that bear, maybe in a title or something like that, instant recognition, instant familiarity. Because of a visual memory? No, they have never seen that visual array before. Take a look. Not one single one of those letters in uppercase looks like its lowercase counterpart. This is a brand new visual stimulus they've never seen before, but it's instantly familiar because it's the letter order that becomes familiar. Interestingly, letters and uppercase, lowercase, different fonts, we treat them as categories. B is like a category, and you see two B's in that category and the first two words, and you see a bunch of others in the same category. Think about the letter G. Uppercase G looks nothing like, there's two versions of the lowercase G. There's the one we write, and there's that little grandpa glasses one that we use when we type, right? All three of those automatically represent G in our long-term memory, and it doesn't matter which one you use. It's the letter, it's that representation. Anyway, the point is it's the letter order that we remember, not the visual look of the word. So sight words are anchored in memory through a process Dr. Airy refers to as a graphophonemic connection forming process. So like grapheme, so that could be a single letter or more than one letter, like TH or SH, IGH, for example. And so we're making a connection between the sounds within the spoken word and the letters. Now, this is hard to understand first time you hear about it. I didn't get it the first time I heard about it back in 1997. But once you get it, once it makes sense, it really opens up a whole world of understanding how this all fits together. What gets in the way is we default in our thinking to phonics. Phonics, we're looking at a word you don't know, and you're applying your letter sound knowledge to figure that out. Orthographic mapping doesn't even start until after you know what the word is. After you know what the word is you're looking at, then you can attach the pronunciation of that word to and make a connection to that sequence of individual letters that are designed to represent that word. And I'll give you an illustration on the next page. So the basic gist is this. We learn best from infancy onward when we can connect something that we're trying to learn to something that's already well established in long-term memory. What's established in long-term memory? The word's pronunciation. So what we're trying to do is connect this new thing, this sequence of letters, to something. And we connect it to the existing sequence of phonemes. And after 1 to 4 exposures, we treat that sequence as a unit. It jumps out at us instantly. No more sounding out is needed. So the only way this happens is if you have a phoneme level analysis of the spoken words. And that's why phonemic awareness, that you hear about it all the time, it's so important. If you can't be aware of the sounds within the word, you're not going to be able to anchor those in the way they do. So if a child doesn't have phonemic awareness, they don't notice the sounds, what are they going to anchor that sequence of letters to? A whole syllable? No, it doesn't work. So it kind of looks like this. So PLTM stands for phonological long-term memory, meaning all the sounds we have. And you may know this, but a slash mark on either side of a letter represents the sound of that letter, not the actual written letter. So a slash mark on either side of the N represents not the letter N. Well, I've used that convention here. I cheated a little bit, and I'm using it for a whole word. So that's the pronounced word 10. That's not the written word 10. And it's stored away in your long-term memory. Now, a child's memory system is ready to anchor the printed word if they can pull apart the individual phonemes. right there, they have anchoring points, right? So when they see the word 10, now they have an anchoring point for that sequence of letters. Here's another example of that, right? Now, the self-teaching hypothesis of David Scher says we learn words after we work through and sound them out. So let's see how that works. You see a new word you haven't seen before. Here's the phonetic decoding part. If you have letter sound knowledge, look what you can do. You can access those are the sounds right there. And then if you blend them, you activate the spoken word. Oh, I'm looking at the word drift, right? I didn't know that till I figured it out. But once you now are looking at the word drift, there's a sense behind the scenes, automatically, you are and I am anchoring those phonemes in the spoken word to that sequence. So that sequence becomes familiar. Now, these are transparent words. The term is used by some of the studies in orthographic mapping for one-to-one correspondence. What about opaque words? So there's not a one-to-one correspondence. So here you have a word like name. Well, we have 3 sounds, 4 letters. So we have to make an adjustment. Now, notice we're talking about something different than phonetic decoding. Phonetic decoding, that E is very useful, isn't it? Okay. It tells us it's name and not nam. But what's it doing for the memory system? Not a whole lot. It's just dangling out there, right? So what happens is we make an adjustment to that. Now, here's a different kind of adjustment. Now, these are considered to be phonetically regular words, each one making a different adjustment between the number of sounds that are stored away and the letters used for them. Now, take a look at this. Here's an irregular word, comb. Isn't this interesting? Because you make the exact same adjustment for the word comb that you make for the word name. So that's why irregular words, we don't have more dyslexia in English-speaking countries than they have in other countries. That may come as a surprise to you, but we don't. And there's tons of research to show that. If irregular words were a problem for orthographic mapping, we would have way more dyslexia in our country than in Canada and England and South Africa and other English-speaking countries, but we don't. So irregular words are a problem for sounding them out, but they're not a problem for tucking them away into memory, okay? So this is what Airy says. Exception words are only exceptional when someone tries to read them by applying a phonetic decoding strategy. When they are learned as sight words, they are secured in memory by the same connections as regularly spelled words. You saw that a moment ago with name and comb, anchored in memory the exact same way. So a lot of regular words require adjustments, just like irregular words do, okay? All right, so here are the skills. This is probably the most important slide, I think. These are the skills that are needed, and this is what's holding back kids with dyslexia. All right, you need letter sound proficiency and phonemic proficiency. Here's an example of letter sound proficiency. End of 1st grade, children on target for learning to read, they can look at a nonsense word like MIP and they'll say MIP instantly. So fast, it's as if it's a word they knew. Now look at what they did in under just a split second. They retrieved the sound for the M, the sound for the I, the sound for the P, then blended together. Not only that, they picked the right sound for the I. If there was an E on the end, they would have said might just as quickly. They did not formulate a silent E rule in that split second with all that they just did. So that is automatic, unconscious access to the letter sounds in that word. That's letter sound proficiency. Now, another child at the end of 1st grade who looks at MIP and says, MIP. That child's already half a school year behind, and they're on a trajectory where their progress is going to be really slow. But you know what they have? They have what they need for phonetic decoding. They have blending, and they have letter sound knowledge, but they're lacking the automaticity. So that's letter sound proficiency. Phonemic proficiency, you say to a child, say sky, sky. Now say sky instead of say a little sly. If a child comes back at you that fast, think about what they did. 4 mental operations. And by the way, kids in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 0.7 of a second is how quickly they do it on average, all right? There are already studies out there. It was a study with kids from Greece, and it was the same with them. We did a study this past spring where we measured that with 50 kids, and 0.7 second on average. And so in that less than a second, they are doing 4 mental operations. Number 1, they're segmenting. Now, this is not segmenting like a segmentation task. This is a mental segmentation that's going on. We can't confuse a skill in our mind that we can't see versus the task we do with kids. The irony is segmentation tasks have the lowest correlations among the lowest correlations with reading compared to other tasks, okay? Other phonemic tasks like deleting a sound or substituting a sound. Anyway, so you had to first segment. Secondly, you had to do phoneme isolation, which is finding the position. Where is that beginning, middle, and end? Oh, there it is in the middle. Then you had to replace the with a o. That's the third operation. The fourth operation is you had to blend, because now you have a different sequence of sounds. 4 mental operations in under a second. That tells me the first operation is automatic, as well as the other ones. So that is phonemic proficiency, having access to those phonemes without even thinking about it. Now, a traditional segmentation task, maybe a child will go quickly. Tell me all the sounds in sky. S, k, I. Do they have automaticity? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. There's another way they could have done that, and that is through tracking through the word. If you said, I want you to count from 1 to 5 as fast as you can, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do you think 1 through 5 popped into their head instantly and they read that out? Or do you think they sequenced their way through 1 through 5? So a segmentation task can never give us the kind of precision in figuring out if you have phoneme proficiency or not than a test that's dedicated to that. And there are 2 of them, and I'll cover those in just a few minutes. All right, so this helps us understand 2 things. Number 1, it helps us understand why these manipulation tasks are so useful. And there's a lot of people out on, I'm not on social media, but people send me stuff all the time. And there's a lot of people bashing these tasks as just mental gymnastics. And read carefully what they're saying, and you're going to find that they're only talking about phonetic decoding. They're missing the whole other part of the process, right? So they keep, right, that is mental gymnastics if your only goal with phonemic knowledge is phonetic decoding. But now you're back at that kid who at the end of 1st grade is going, and you're good to go. But you're not good to go. That's unfortunately a little patronizing for me to put it that way. But the point is that they obviously don't understand where the phonemic skills fit into remembering words. And then it also helps us know how we can pull it off. How can we pull off that automatic unconscious memory for words that we did with those tens of thousands of words? It's because the skills needed for that are also automatic. Oh, the key takeaway here is letter sound knowledge is not enough and phonemic awareness is not enough. And I'm going to show you that phonemic awareness is not enough. You have to have that phonemic automaticity, what I call phonemic proficiency. So here you have, this is a nationally normed test, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, 4th edition, came out in 2020. And they separated instant responding to a phonemic item versus a correct item that's slow. So if they responded in under 2 seconds, they got a different score than if they responded over 2 seconds. And we pulled these apart. The developer of this test and I presented it at a scientific conference. And look at how these correlations, you may or may not know much about these correlations. You see the 0.67 at the top and 0.68 over there. That's very impressive, all right? The highest you can get is 1.0. You never get that. But with a segmentation task, you might hit 0.4, 0.5 when you're 6-year-old, maybe 7, and it drops off after that. So, but here you see a consistent, strong correlation throughout the whole lifespan. Now, here's what's interesting. If it was an instant response, you see that column, it remained strong throughout the whole lifespan. But if you got it right, showing awareness of phonemes, but you did it slowly, it hovers around 0. So in other words, being able to do a phonemic awareness item, but doing it slowly isn't really telling us much about reading at all. This fits exactly with Linnea Airey's theory. We have to have that instant access to those phonemes for this memory process to work. So that's what I mean by phonemic awareness isn't enough. You have to have phonemic proficiency. Phonemic awareness is necessary because it's a step toward proficiency. So we get accuracy with things before proficiency. Now let's translate this to kids with dyslexia. We gathered this data at a local high school. 9th through 12th graders you see at the bottom, 68 of them, and then also students from that same district. And we look at the items correct on a phonemic task. They were lower than the 2nd graders. See the 27 versus the 29 that's in bold. It wasn't statistically significant, but even that's significant. They weren't even better than 2nd graders, right? And look at their instant responding. The speed of response was worse than 1st graders. So they lacked a key skill that's necessary for remembering words. And that's why they continued as having dyslexia throughout high school, and all of them had an IEP, and we're getting services for that. Now, I do want to make a comment here. I know I've only got a minute or two left. I may go just a teeny bit beyond that. We have a bit of a problem on social media. I told you I'm not on social media, but people fill me in on stuff all the time. The National Reading Panel reviewed experimental findings to look at causal relationships and found that teaching phonemic awareness resulted in better reading and spelling than not teaching phonemic awareness. That was it. That was the end of their experimental finding. But then they looked at a bunch of other things, and they prefaced it by saying these are just suggestive, they're tentative, they're maybe not the final word. And they looked at things like group size and age of the kids, et cetera. And one of them, they said, they were comparing studies that taught phonemic awareness with letters versus teaching phonemic awareness without letters. But they never defined what they meant by that. It got unfortunately filled in by social media, and that interpretation is incorrect, okay? The nice thing is they illustrated what they meant with 8 different studies they described that they called teaching phonemic awareness with letters. And all 8 of them, they taught phonemic awareness with oral activities, and then filled in with letters at some point, backfilled with letters, and showed how it connected with letters. So what you're hearing on social media about this are from people that have not taken the time to look into this. They're passing it along, stuff they hear, even people with academic positions, which is unfortunate. So contrary to the National Reading Panel misinformation out there, they never downplayed the value of oral phonemic awareness activities, never at any point. And they never said that letters should be visible during all or most phonemic awareness activities. That just turns it into phonics. You might following this advice, you're going to end up with kids in that bottom right quadrant we saw earlier who are going to be good at sounding out words, but not necessarily good at remembering words. And another thing that people told me is being said is that once you introduce letters, you don't need to do any more oral phonemic awareness. Well, guess what? The studies the National Reading Panel reviewed, they didn't pull up stakes on doing oral activities once letters were introduced. So this is all part of people on social media, they're trying to find out what's the best way to do it. But unfortunately, there was a viral misinterpretation, and it's not being helpful. So the bottom line is what the reading panel did is kind of being undermined. Now, I'm kind of low on time here. I really, what you can kind of take from here as we go through is that we go back to this and say, we need to test each of these skills, and we need to make sure they're all trained. We need to work on the dribbling, the passing, the shooting, and the playing, the defense. So if I take one chunk out of there, the phonetic decoding and the orthographic lexicon, we have fluency is a great test to do to find out with how the word level reading. Traditional word identification tests are good at that. For phonetic decoding, any kind of untimed nonsense word. A lot of those say you have a 3 or 5 second limit. That's all the time in the world, folks. Okay, so I consider them untimed. They're functionally untimed. Testing the orthographic lexicon, there are some timed word lists that are great. They're listed there. I could follow up if any of you need to do this for testing or whatever, but they're really good. They're on the market, and they will give an estimate. Does this child have a large sight vocabulary or not? So I'm taking another piece out of here. You look across the bottom. I'm going to leave the letters there because just to see how they go up to orthographic mapping goes up to the orthographic lexicon, letter sound blending, etc. You said that works. Okay, letter sound knowledge. Nothing more needs to be said because on the previous screen, that's testing your phonetic decoding. But also blending. There is a test, comprehensive test of phonological processing, has a blending word subtest, but blending's built into nonsense word reading. If they can't read nonsense words, then you might want to separately test and find out if they're not good at blending. Letter sound proficiency, there's time versions of nonsense words. That gets back to like the kid who can say MIP instantly, right? You want to know that, and we have tests for that. Phonemic proficiency, I only know of 2 tests. One is built into the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, but the other is free online, thepasstest.com. You download it, you practice it, you follow the instructions, and then you can distinguish between kids who have it instantly and kids who don't. Now, just to show how this fits in with preventing, teaching kids in kindergarten, first grade, big difference in kids who get this instruction, particularly kids who struggle. You see that they end up doing better than kids that don't get taught phonemic awareness. And as time goes on, that gap widens. The kids who got the instruction and the kids that didn't, right? And then when it comes to, of course, what do they do? Phonemic awareness. There you go. Okay, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. But I'm ending here with saying that the research on intervention, you have most studies, unfortunately, they just keep trying to build a better phonics mousetrap. And most studies, you get about a 3 standard score point gain, barely enough to notice with kids. And basically, these studies, there's no training of any oral phonemic awareness. They just train phonics. One very major study had the attitude of, oh, they're in 2nd grade now. We're not going to do phonemic awareness. Like that should have just been kindergarten first. It's like, well, if they don't have it, they need that skill. It's like taking a kid, a really tall kid, and bring him into a basketball team, but he can't dribble. Well, he's past that. We're not going to teach him to dribble. It makes no sense. But it made all the top journals. They published 2 studies on it. Anyway, so the connected text just means real reading. And then they had another group that had moderate, where you start to notice an improvement with the kids. And everyone did phonics. If you don't do phonics, you never make it out of that first group. Okay. So the best results are always going to include phonics. And they all got reading practice, but they did basic phonological segmentation enough. It's equivalent to an ending 1st grade level. So they didn't take them far enough to make it automatic, but at least they nudged them in the right direction. The studies that got the largest standard score gains that range from 14 to 17, they aggressively went after the phonemic awareness skills. And they also did phonics and reading practice. So it goes back to what you saw on that chart earlier. These are the skills that we need to develop in kids. To summarize, word level reading is primarily phonological in nature. It's not about visual memory. And skilled readers are good at sounding out words and remembering words. And to do that, you need to have letter sound automaticity, and you need to have phonemic automaticity. Fluency, as I only mentioned in passing, depends on how many words you know in the passage. So the more words you know, the more fluent you become. And reading problems are preventable and correctable. And I recommend you take a look at some of these here. Oops, that last one, Oak Hill, Cane, and Elbros, the one I highlighted. It balances out what I talked about this evening because it covers what we need to know about reading comprehension.
Incredible day. I mean, thank you so much for pulling back the curtain, really exposing what happens when we're navigating to read, and why throughout the years there have been different curriculum and approaches that have come across, and it's not just one or the other. It hasn't just been having exposures to words is enough. That it has to be that 2-step process. Phonics is not enough, but it's also that phonemic proficiency that has to be that second part to get us through. I want to make sure that we have time for some questions. We did have a couple of questions that came in even before our talk tonight, but we'll start with the ones that are in the queue. If you have additional questions, audience, make sure that you add those to the queue right now. We want to make sure that we get through all of them. If not, we will also have opportunity to answer those questions after this talk. So the first question comes through is, what is the best way to help students with spelling?
That is a great question. That's one of the beauties of this concept of orthographic mapping. So I'll try not to tell the whole story because it's a great story and I'd love to tell it. But my grandson, we found out, had dyslexia. Okay, which was a puzzle to us because we didn't know about a family history. But then my daughter-in-law talked to her parents about it, at which point one of her parents disclosed, I never told you this before, but I was the weakest reader throughout all of my school years, right? And that was the 60s and 70s. Anyway, and so at the end of 2nd grade, he was at like ending kindergarten level and everything. I tested him on all the nationally standardized stuff. He was the 2nd to 10th percentile and everything, way down at the bottom. His younger brother in kindergarten was reading the comics page. All right. So quite a bit of difference. Anyway, we worked with this. We developed those skills, and he became a typical reader. And when he went to 4th grade, he was out from 3rd grade, as was the whole country from COVID-19. But then when he was in 4th grade, he went back. And what startled me, I didn't anticipate it, is his mother was told that he was one of the best readers in class and one of the best spellers. I was puzzled by that. And it wasn't until a discussion I had with Dr. David Page out at Northern Illinois University, who did studies with separating out the automatic and non-automatic from the Wechsler scales. And he found with the spelling that the non-automatic didn't correlate with the spelling, but the automatic did. that's when I had the insight. Of course, phonics allows you to know and be able to segment and know what letters might go with it, but it's so unreliable. Are you going to spell scent, S-E-N-T, C-E-N-T, or S-C-E-N-T, right? So there's still some guesswork. But orthographic mapping, you've nailed down in memory that precise letter order. So it's a whole different process than phonics, right? Not whole different. There's overlap, obviously, because they both involve the code and sounds. So I think Dr. David Page has kind of solved that mystery for me. I was too much in because I've been an advocate of phonics my whole career since 1988 when I started working as a school psychologist. And so used to hearing, oh, they're really doing better in reading, but their spelling's not great. And I got locked into the phonics mentality of thinking and not realize, wait, with orthographic mapping, you're locking in a particular letter order, so you're going to be a better speller. And to this day, he's a better speller. He's an 8th grader and doing very well and loves to read.
We had another question around is a speech to print approach recommended for supporting students with phonemic awareness? This is a similar question that someone asked a little bit earlier in the day, sent to me around how much time should be spent on phonemic awareness alone, or what activities would you recommend when thinking about integrating phonemic awareness in writing?
So I'm not a specialist on writing, so I'm gonna be a little evasive on that. When it comes to different kids are going to need a different amount with phonics and phonemic awareness, right? And so the issue becomes, are they able to notice any particular sound in any particular position within the word? So if you download the PASS test, the phonological awareness screening test, you'll see on that test that every possible position within a single syllable word is being referenced. And so it starts out with easier items, gets harder. So it starts out with, like, say cat without the at, and so you got the first sound, say hand and change the to a sand, right? So you're dealing with just that first sound, and then ending sound, deleting, and then internal vowel sounds, and then breaking up blends. The external part of a blend, say sled without the sled, right? And kids are going to go ed most of the time, right? And so you can't pull that apart. And same thing with the ending, right? Say best without the, bet. So every possible position that a sound can be in, because that's what we have to do when we map. When we map a word, we have to map every letter sound relationship, that graphophonemic processing that Dr. Airy talks about. So anyway, that's the broader issue, is you want to make sure that they develop that skill. And I would say you probably can devote about just a few minutes a day to teaching. See, you have to develop phonemic awareness with these children before you develop the proficiency. Okay. I know people use these 1-minute activities, these time drills, and they use that to try to teach phonemic awareness. That's like using your screwdriver as a hammer. They're kind of banging the back of the screw. It's not the right tool. That's designed to help automaticity once you have the phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness is taught with tokens. It's taught with oral activities, stretching out sounds, repeating sounds. All those types of things are throughout the research literature. And when it comes to letters, this is not a good analogy, but it's all I got at the moment. But think of a ladder, a vertical. You have 2 vertical supports, and then you have rungs going across. You have to preserve the integrity of those in order to have a ladder. And so you have to preserve the integrity of what phonemic awareness is and the oral nature of it and the activities you do. And the same thing with phonics. But you're going back and forth between the two all the time. So this kind of artificial thing that you have to have letters in front of kids to do phonemic awareness. Again, that's just we don't have any research to support that, right? That's not what the reading panel said. So you want to be able to do some oral stuff, but you want to show them how letters are involved. Or sometimes you can use letters visibly to have a breakthrough. I had a kid who didn't respond to the blocks, didn't respond to the oral stuff. He was in 4th grade, and I got the opportunity to tutor him. He was in 4th grade, reading at a 1st grade level, and the reading teachers were like, we can't figure this kid out. And I tried everything, and I couldn't get it to work. And I'd say brush without the b. He'd say ush. No matter what I did, I couldn't get him to notice that. So finally, I wrote out B-R-U-S-H. And I covered up the B, and he saw the word rush. He was in first grade. He could handle that. And I did several of those. He had his aha moment. Then I set aside the letters, went back to blocks, made it oral, and then we could go back and forth, right? So make sure, because if you always do it with letters, you don't know if they have phonemic awareness. All they need is letter sound knowledge. All they need is phonic knowledge. So they could be in that lower right quadrant and not be progressing. So you have to incorporate oral instruction as well as incorporating letters.
And in that, I guess the segue question is, do you think how much of an aspect of auditory processing do you think is a challenge in that through that progression as well?
Well, really, it depends. If someone would need to tell me what they mean by auditory processing, because on one level, you could say just something, you go to an audiologist to find out if they're even noticing or hearing the sounds.
Mm-hmm.
If children can participate in normal language, like if you can hold a conversation with someone, then, I mean, our phonology is based on the auditory system, right? It's just sounds of voices. That means that child, to be able to have normal conversation in language, and if they can produce language pretty well, they can distinguish between and among all the syllables in English. So they're able to process that auditory information. So if a child can hold a typical conversation, they have the skills and potential to break into those syllables and get at the level of the phoneme, right? So it's not auditory anymore. It's become strictly phonological. So I think one of the things is being more precise. With auditory, you're talking about they have a difficulty with environmental sounds, like, you see what I mean? Or are you talking about language, perceiving language? And so this is a big country, and I'm sure I'll come across that kid someday. But in all of my years, we started using this in 2001 in our school district, and I've used it with just lots of kids. I've never had a kid who couldn't develop that skill. And there was a study in Annals of Dyslexia where they had 232 individuals that went to a clinic in Canada, all of whom had dyslexia. And all but one of those individuals, and they were from age 5 to 55, and all of those individuals improved their phonemic skills except one. I met the director of that clinic and I said, "Can you find that one guy for me? I want to take a crack at this, okay?" This was published back in 1994. And he said, "Sorry, we don't have the data still from that time period, blah, blah, blah." But the other interesting thing about it was 75% of those individuals ended up with perfectly normal phonemic awareness. And they did the intensive training. Like you saw, that study I'm referring to was in that category of the 10 to 20, 25 standard score point gains. Okay, if you do the math, 1 out of 232 is less than 0.5%. So we can move forward with kids and say, every one of those kids had dyslexia. This kid will develop these skills if we train it. And you're going to be wrong 1 out of every, less than 1 out of every 100 times, right?
Another question is, are there any additional strategies to use to speed up the process of automation with students when we talk about orthographic mapping?
Yes. Okay. You have to train the phonemic skills to automaticity. And so what happens, I think, is people say, "Oh, this child can segment. They have what they need." No, they don't. You have to keep developing it so the child gets faster. This is what we've noticed is we do the deletion and substitution activities with the kids, and we do everything, right? We do Mokromallin, but the thing is, if you do deletion and substitution, you have built into that segmentation and you have built into that blending usually. Like I gave the example from sky to sly, you have to segment to do that. You go from sand to hand, you have to blend, right? So these are built in. It's kind of like people don't carry around a separate calendar from a separate flip phone, from a separate from a separate notepad. It's all together, right? So those tasks, which numerous research, even though they get bashed online, I'm happy to send this to you and you can share it with people. I accumulated just by coming across this stuff, didn't even do a search, of researchers across the decades talking about the superiority of doing phoneme deletion and substitution activities versus segmentation and blending. Okay, this is what the research this is why there's a gap sometimes between the science of reading and the actual research, scientific research in that particular topic. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to bash the science of reading movement. It's doing, it's great things, but some things need to be tweaked. Um, so uh, so anyway, the what I just took myself on a tangent. What was you saying? Remember, it's late here in the East.
Yeah, it's very late. No, it was just about around the strategies around speeding up the
Oh yeah,
process
yeah.
of
Okay,
knowledge.
so
All right.
once they can do it, you work with them, and we find kids eventually become automatic. Okay, so stick with it. They eventually can do it automatically. But someone mentioned speech to print earlier. Okay,
Mhm.
so speech to print is actually has some parallels to what Aries trying to have us do. So, for example, having a kid, exposing a kid to the oral form of a word before you even show it to them. So, let's say you say to the child, "Okay, this is going to be one of our tricky words. The word is said. What's the word said?" Or you can small group or whatever, whole class, and you say, "All right, what's the first sound you hear in the word said?" Some kid's going to go S. You say, no, 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 I'm not talking about letters here. I want you to tell me about sounds. What's the first sound? S. Very good. What's the last sound you hear in the word said? D, right? I'm speeding things up a little bit. All right. What sound you hear in the middle of said? Ah, great. Okay, now we're going to see how this is spelled, and you're going to see why this is one of our tricky words. What letter do you think we're going to use to spell the S in said? S, yes, write it down. You have the kids write it down, having them spell. Oh my gosh. In some of those studies that got those great results, they did intensive work with spelling. Because when you're getting kids to spell and spelling specific things correctly, you're helping them map that sequence and you're pulling it apart. So you're kind of doing, it's almost like you're bringing out publicly what we want them to do privately in their mind, which is take the sounds as the anchoring point and attach the letters to those. So you go through, okay, what do you think is going to be the sound that goes with the d, or the letter? Oh, D, good. Write it there. Leave a space. All right. What letter usually says E, but not in said? And this is why it's one of our tricky words. All right. Watch how we do it, and you write the AI and you say, see, isn't that kind of weird? All right. You write that down. That's what it is. Let's all cover it up. Let's all spell it SAID, right? That's how you spell said. Now, when you do that, it's ready for a place in a stack of flashcards. But traditionally, and I gave this bad advice from 1988 to 1997 before I started learning about this stuff, was, oh, that's irregular. You just got to have them learn it. Just put on a flashcard and have them learn it. Very inefficient. It works great for kids who can learn to orthographically map on their own just fine, but it doesn't work for the weaker readers. So when we take the time to do that, so getting kids to spell, getting kids to think about the sounds and see the connection with the letters, that is, in a sense, orthographically mapping with them.
Great. We'll ask one more question, and that question is, do you see speech articulation errors having a role in phonemic awareness?
It's well, let me say a couple things. First of all, yes, among kids with articulation problems, they're a higher risk for phonemic awareness problems. But that's not a given because you have to remember articulation has to do with expressive language, or even actually expressive language is more the content. But we're talking about receptive. They're hearing those sounds and they're hearing other people pronounce. When I first started working as a school psychologist in the late 80s, we had to do full evaluations of every kid, including every child with articulation. I was like, oh my gosh, these kids are going to be lousy spellers because the way they're saying the words. I was pleasantly surprised that their spelling was fine, many of them, right? And they didn't have the phonemic issues at all. It was strictly a motor articulation issue. So they were hearing it just fine. They were processing it just fine. They had a hard time producing it. So the bottom line is it's mixed. It's both, right? You're going to have some kids, there is a higher risk for phonemic awareness problems among kids with articulation problems. That's well established. But we can't assume that. There's a large portion of those kids where their phonemic awareness can be perfectly fine.
Great. Well, Dave, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I know it's late for you. I know we didn't get to all the questions tonight, but if you had a question that wasn't answered or one comes up in the next couple of days, please reach out to us at outreach@hamlinrobinson.org. Again, that's outreach@hamlinrobinson.org. We'll get those over to Dave, or we'll answer those for you ourselves. There'll be a print resource that I'll be sharing with you in the coming days from tonight's lecture. And as I said previously, next week we'll be uploading the recording for this presentation for you to download and review and share with your friends. So again, thank you again, Dave, for this wonderful presentation, talk, and just really opening our eyes around the challenges and how we can improve ourselves in the way that we support and interact with students and think differently about our strategies. And so for everyone else in the audience, we thank you again for joining this HRS Speaker Series event, and we'll see you next month. Have a good night.